Maverick News. The world is watching. Greetings, brave Mavericks. Our quest for truth continues. We go beyond fake news. Together we expose propaganda. Together we pull others out of rabbit holes. We are maverick thinkers. We are all unique individuals, defenders of individual rights and freedoms, credible, trusted, grounded in reality. Maverick News, Maverick News. Defending free speech, free speech. Donate at freedomreporters.com. Do it now. Tomorrow may be too late. Maverick News. The world is watching.
And welcome, Mr. Browde. Levi Browde, thank you so much for joining us on the program today. I think this is, an extremely important subject. I'm so glad that you could share some of this information with us. Can you bring us up to speed on what's happening with this investigation into these bomb threats?
Sure. I mean, it started about a little over 2 weeks ago. We started to get bomb threats and other similar type of threats emailed to the Shen Yun headquarters in Orange County, New York. And shortly after that, theaters where Shen Yun, there are 8 Shen Yun troops that perform in different parts of the world at any given time. And so theaters across California, and I think even in Vancouver, Canada, started getting similar bomb threats. And then we got more threats coming into the main headquarters that were targeting not just said some fairly gruesome things about what they would do to people here, and then they started making threats on targets in Taiwan, for example. We just had a troop that landed in Taiwan at that time, so they were targeting sites in Taiwan, and then they started even threatening sites in Washington, D.C., FBI headquarters, one of them. And so obviously this was very alarming. We've been working with local authorities and the FBI from day one.
And so when did these threats first surface?
March 14th, really, was the first one that came in, and they continued for about 2.5 weeks after that. Yeah.
And obviously you have to take these things very seriously every time a threat is leveled, right?
We do, and especially in our case, we've had several incidents where individuals were threatening the physical security of the campus here, where Shen Yun has its headquarters in New York. We've had a long history going back more than a dozen years of things like people slashing the tires of our tour buses to the point where they don't deflate, but they damage the structural integrity of the tires. So when it gets up to speed on the highway, they'll burst. And so that's just one example. We have many of these kind of things over the years. And so we're very cognizant of security, and we work regularly with the local law enforcement. They're well aware of our situation. Yeah.
So when you say you do have some evidence to suggest who or what organizations might be behind this?
Well, it's tough, and it's tough for a couple of reasons. One is the Chinese Communist Party, which we'll get into a little bit about why they're so focused on Shen Yun, but they are. They often use, sometimes they'll use their diplomats, sometimes even the ambassadors involved at trying to threatening, governments and theaters to cancel Shen Yun, but very often they'll use thugs and proxies. And so the evidence on tracing it back, let's say, to the Chinese embassy is difficult, or tracing it back to Beijing. Sometimes we can do that, especially with email-based attacks. In the past, we've traced them back to certain ministries in Beijing. But often it's they use these third-party proxies, they use thugs, they use sort of pro-CCP organizations. And so what you really only have for sure is clearly somebody who's trying to threaten, harm a performing arts company, and there's really only one group of people in the world that would be interested in doing that, which is the CCP.
And why would they want to do that?
So it's a bit of a story, but I think the short version of is that, when the communists took power in 1949, what they started to do is they unleashed campaign after campaign, because they were trying to take one of the oldest and most sort of spiritual civilizations on earth, and they're trying to impose Marxism on it, which is a completely foreign doctrine. It came from Germany. And so they're trying to impose Marxism on people. So what they did is they systematically tried to destroy Chinese traditional culture, which again is a very spiritual culture. It's where, came Buddhism, Taoism, Confucianism. And so they've been trying to dismantle this culture. Along comes Shen Yun, and what they're doing is saying, okay, it's really a renaissance. I mean, Shen Yun you can think of as the Chinese Renaissance, because they're taking the authentic culture that the communist regime tried to destroy, and they're putting it on stage for the world to see. And what the world is seeing is, one, it's very beautiful, it's hopeful, it's very spiritual, and none of this is what the CCP wants them to see. However, the second component is that Shen Yun was started by practitioners of Falun Gong, the Buddhist-based spiritual practice that's been horrifically persecuted in China for the last quarter century. And so the show is sort of a testament to the virtue and the character of Falun Gong people. And over the last 25 years, the CCP has spent hundreds of millions trying to convince the world that Falun Gong's weird, it's a cult or something like that. Along comes this show, and people see something that's beautiful and hopeful, and in many cases brings them to tears, and they're like, that doesn't look like a cult. So for those two reasons, the cultural sort of threat, and then how they portray Falun Gong, they really think of it as a massive threat ideologically to the whole narrative they've used to seize and maintain power in China.
So you're using art to showcase culture and history, and they see that as a real threat. Because why? Is this contrary to Marxist ideology in some way?
Very much so. I mean, I think that's one of the main components. There are other components, but this whole idea, because particularly with Chinese culture, was a very spiritual culture, and that Marxism is officially atheist, and in order to secure power and maintain power, they've had to kind of root out this spiritual culture of China and say, no, there's no divine or spiritual realm. There's just the Communist Party. That's the one and only authority that they want people to recognize. And so any endeavor that it takes authentic Chinese culture and shows actually this is what it really was, and shows how spiritual it was and how connected it was with the divine, that's going to be a huge threat. In addition to that, just the idea that, one of the ways the CCP has maintained power is to convince the Chinese people, honestly, of false narratives. One of which is the CCP is China, and without the CCP, the China would be lost. It wouldn't be able to function, and those are two blatant lies. The CCP is an import. Started in Europe and went through Russia and came into China. They violently seized power, so it's not the same thing as China. And the CCP is not the shepherd of Chinese culture or people. And this show makes all that really, really clear. Because when you see the show, you're like, oh, not only is this real Chinese culture the CCP tries to destroy, but the CCP has been a force that's not been good for China and not been good for the Chinese people or its culture. And so it's a direct challenge. It wasn't meant to be that. The folks at Shen Yun put on the show because they thought the value of this culture, like many other traditional cultures around the world, had a lot to offer the world. It had a lot, when you go to Italy and you see artistic works of the Renaissance, you may not be a Christian, but you stand in front of the statue of David. It's very moving. The story is moving. It's something about it touches you. And I think that the folks at Shen Yun feel the same way about Chinese culture. But the CCP sees that and they go, okay, this is challenging the entirety of the foundation that we've built our legitimacy as a ruler of China upon.
And is the Falun Gong then part of the show? Is it how integrated is the Falun Gong to the Shen Yun performance? the performance, I guess, encompasses a lot of the old culture, but the Falun Gong is part of that?
It is. Actually, that's a really good question. I haven't heard it put it that way before. That's a really good question because, yes, the Falun Gong group, they're the ones who started Shen Yun. Yes, they're the ones who put it on the show and run the show. But here's what most people miss, and that is Falun Gong itself, like many practices that go back for thousands of years in China, it is very much heartland Chinese. It is from the Buddhist school of teachings. Actually, back in the 1990s, when Falun Gong was first introduced, it was wildly popular. I mean, you go to any park in China, big cities, tiny villages, there would be people doing Falun Gong. Because it really, again, it was their kind of renaissance. It was the reemergence of traditional spiritual culture, traditional Chinese culture. And so Falun Gong, as its essence, is very connected to Chinese culture. People who practice Falun Gong naturally have a deep understanding and appreciation for Chinese culture. And so as the persecution unfolded in China, one of the things, at least in the Falun Gong community, was recognized is that this was not just a persecution of this one faith group. This was kind of the last nail in the coffin to destroy Chinese culture entirely. Because again, you can't really separate entirely Falun Gong from traditional Chinese culture. They're very much integrated. And this was the reemergence, the sort of last gasping breath of this culture that they've been trying to destroy. So in trying to destroy Falun Gong, this was sort of the last wave to destroy Chinese culture. So Falun Gong was uniquely positioned to say, okay, if we're going to bring back the culture, we have a very deep understanding, we have a clear understanding of what that is, and we have the capability to put that on stage. And so when you, coming back to your question, when you see the show, there's about 20 dance pieces, give or take, and it spans all of Chinese history. So sometimes it's stories pulling from the great works of Chinese literature. Sometimes it's different stories from different dynasties or different ethnics or regions around China. So it's very varied. And you see some Buddhist stories, you see some Taoist stories, but part of the fabric of Chinese culture, part of that story is Falun Gong. So in one or two pieces, you'll also see Falun Gong stories alongside the Buddhist stories and the Taoist stories. So it is very much part of the show in that sense, but it's definitely a small part because the show is trying to tell the story of Chinese civilization, 5,000 years of Chinese civilization. And so you really get a lot of different types of stories coming through the show.
So is it fair to say that this illustrates the importance of the existence of the United States and Canada and Western countries where this expression of Chinese heritage can still be on full display for people? Is it important?
It's very important. And I think actually you've touched upon something that I think is another reason that really angers the CCP. And that is, if you look at the whole world, why is it in America you find the company that's being the torchbearers of Chinese culture, authentic Chinese culture? I mean, this is an American company. It's based here in New York. And the idea that it's an American enterprise that's delving into what is real Chinese culture and how to share that with the world, I think also irks the CCP, because in a way it's sort of like the American government, strictly speaking, you could say the American government is a more productive and effective shepherd of nurturing traditional Chinese culture than the CCP with respect to Shen Yun.
And by extension, I guess, Canada as well.
Absolutely. I mean, that's the other thing is there's a fairly visible presence of Falun Gong community in Canada. Shen Yun tours every year, everywhere from Vancouver to Quebec and Toronto and everywhere in between, Calgary. And so, yeah, it's very much something that tours through Canada as well.
Yeah, I've seen the Shen Yun buses on the highways here in Ontario, where I live, up around the Toronto area. What steps are being taken to make sure that those buses are safe, that the people in the theaters are safe? That must be front and center and paramount for you.
Yeah, I mean, about 12 years ago, it was interesting. In just one weekend, we had buses that were simultaneously, I think, in Manitoba, Arkansas in the U.S., and Arizona. And in one weekend was the first time that the tires, the front, and particularly the front tires of our buses were slashed in this manner so that they would burst at high speeds. One did here in the US.
In fact, here's a picture of one right there that
Yep.
you can see just a slash, but not all the way through.
Yeah, that's right. And so after that weekend, what we instituted was we have 24/7 security watching our buses everywhere we go in the world. So that's one measure we're doing to keep safe on the road. Now, with these bomb threats, again, mostly we've worked with local authorities. So, for example, in California, the police were there. They even brought bomb sniffing dogs in at some point to go through the whole theater and make sure it's safe. Honestly, and they found, no bombs, obviously, in the theater. No shows have been disrupted. And I'm not surprised by that because, again, the goal here, for years, they tried to convince governments. I mean, we did a whole report came out about 3 months about the global campaign of the CCP trying to shut Shen Yun down worldwide. And it studied over 38 countries, over 130 incidents where government officials or thugs or what have you are trying to convince local governments not to have a Shen Yun show, trying to convince theaters not to have a Shen Yun show. And when none of that's working, try these scare tactics to scare people not to go to the show. And that's been everything from, just to give you a quick example, back in 2020, when one of our troops was going to Salt Lake City to perform, this whole WeChat, and mainly Chinese, and we think most of them were in mainland China, this whole WeChat group started to spread this rumor that, Shen Yun is coming to town and they're coming directly from China and they're all infected from COVID and they need to cancel the show because if you go to the show, you're going to get COVID. And it got so bad that the Utah State Department of Health had to take to their Twitter page and said, okay, people, first of all, Shen Yun is in America. They're banned in China. They can't even go there. There's no COVID threat. Everybody calm down. But those kind of smear tactics, they've done all kinds of things like that to sort of intimidate theaters, to intimidate theater goers. So these bomb threats, I think it's best to understand them as the latest incarnation of a way to try and scare Americans, scare Canadians not to go to the theater. That's their goal. And so that's obviously we're taking all the precautions. We're working with law enforcement, but really we see this as a scare tactic, and it didn't just fall out of the sky. This is part of a trend.
Now, I have heard about the Falun Gong. I've heard stories about the way they're treated in China. Can you elaborate on that for us?
Sure. So again, going back to the 90s, I mentioned that this was a very popular spiritual practice, and it really, the government didn't take a whole lot of notice of it initially because it was part of, the Qigong exercises, and there was a huge Qigong boom. And so it became very popular. But one of the things that in 1999, the government did a survey and found that there were 70 to 100 million people practicing. So that's 40 million more than the members of the Communist Party. And at that point, the top leader of China at the time, Jiang Zemin, he ordered it be crushed. And there was a real power struggle because there were people, even at the top level of the Politburo, who had family that were practicing Falun Gong. I mean, Falun Gong was everywhere. It was in the military, it was in police, it was in universities, it was in rural farm areas. I mean, it was literally everywhere in the country. I mean, trying to go after Falun Gong in China was like trying to go after all Catholics in Canada and in the US. I mean, you're going after an entire portion of society. So needless to say, his order won the day. And so starting in 1999 and continuing to today, if you're a Falun Gong person in China, you're essentially a Jew in 1938 Germany. You can lose your job, get out of housing. There's an enormous amount of people who are just destitute because they can't go home because the police are hounding them so much. Millions of people have been incarcerated in labor camps or later on just prisons or black jails or these kind of facilities. We know well over 5,000 who've been tortured to death, and that's just the cases we've been able to verify. A tribunal was started in London in 2019 where they did a year-long investigation of the crime of forced organ harvesting. And that is the practice of taking large numbers of primarily Falun Gong practitioners, although today it's also Uyghurs and other groups, and pre-testing them for their organs, blood type and things like that, and then killing them when someone needs an organ transplant. And that tribunal in 2019 found that there was 60 to 100,000 of these transplants being done a year, potentially killing that many people per year. So the sum total of what has happened to Falun Gong, most people call it a cold genocide, that really know what they're talking about. But regardless, it's been a tremendous human rights crisis, tremendous amount loss of life, suffering, and just, again, we're talking about 100 million people. So just imagine the ripple effects throughout society. It's like, if you're a Falun Gong practitioner in a workplace, everybody else in that workplace is in jeopardy, because if they don't turn you in, they themselves could have problems. So it really tore apart the fabric of society in China much more than they're disclosing, and this continues today.
I guess that's a hallmark of a communist society, where you have citizens turning in citizens for crimes against the state like that. We've seen some of that over the last 4 years to some degree, even here, with some authoritarian overreach from government, perhaps just an overreaction to the pandemic. But I guess that's the dark side that folks have to live with over there.
And I think, very much so. And I think it's also important to realize, and most people miss this, is that the Falun Gong, persecution of Falun Gong didn't just, it didn't just fall out of the sky, come from nowhere. I mean, if you look at the CCP's reign, starting in 1949, every 7 or 10 years, they have a campaign where they go after a group. So in 49 to 52, they went after landlords, right? And anybody who owned land, they killed their whole family. They took their land for land distribution. And then they went after intellectuals. And then they went after capitalists. And then they went after artistic people. And then you had the whole Cultural Revolution, where it was sort of like you really literally had children turning in their parents. And so there's been campaign after campaign with the idea of destroying the culture, engender fear in the people so that the CCP reigns supreme. And really, the most accurate way to understand what's happened to Falun Gong is as the latest campaign in that trend that's been happening for 70 plus years. And
the CCP continues to deny all of this, right?
So with respect to Falun Gong, it's an interesting third rail issue. In the first few years, when Jiang Zemin, the top guy, ordered that Falun Gong be eliminated, it was very Cultural Revolution style. I mean, I had a friend actually in Beijing at the time, and you literally had trucks driving down the middle of the street with bullhorns and big placards on the back saying Falun Gong is banned, it's evil, stay away from them, they're awful. I mean, stuff you had during the Cultural Revolution. And so it was very much this frenzied campaign. When they started to get a significant amount of pushback in the international community around 2002, 2003, that's where everything went silent. Total silence. So you don't see it in the media. I mean, back in 2000, it was literally on TV every day, papers every day. Falun Gong is evil, Falun Gong is this, they're that. And they just went completely silent because they realized they were hoping this was going to be quick. I mean, we even have on record Jiang Zemin saying this is 3 months, stamp out this whole group. And as the years wore on and they found that wasn't happening, they took it completely underground. And so for the last 20 years, it's been very quiet on publicly. Now, Ethan Gutmann, who's probably one of the foremost researchers on at least early on in the forced organ harvesting crimes, he said it best, and that is, if you want to know the quickest way to end a meeting with any Chinese diplomat anywhere, just mention Falun Gong, meeting's over. So they just won't talk about it. They don't want to hear it, and they will cover up any evidence of the crimes they've committed against Falun Gong.
But you're determined to continue to bring it to the public, and you are part of an organization, right, that is involved in education. Can you tell us about that?
Sure. So, back it was the fall of 1999, just a few months into this persecution, we realized that there was just a huge vacuum in the West. I mean, everybody knows when something happens to Jewish people, everyone knows what a Jewish person is, or a Christian, everybody knows that. Falun Gong, they're like, what is that? Is that a person? Is it a city? So we started, a bunch of volunteers, we started the Falun Dafa Information Centre in an apartment in Manhattan back in '99. And for the last 25 years, every single day, via different sources, primarily the Minghui website, we get firsthand, on the ground reports about what's happening all around China. So a person's mother was taken to a prison camp, another person's cousin or brother was tortured to death. We're getting those reports every single day. And we take those, we analyze them, we correlate them, we produce human rights reports to hand to Canadian Parliament, US Congress in the US, to hand to human rights groups. And really our sole focus is giving a voice to Falun Gong and making sure the persecution is as documented as it can be, given all the restrictions and all the dangers that there is inside China. I mean, because, people have been tortured and killed just for exposing this to the international community.
And do you have a website? How can people find out more about your organization?
Sure. Our website is faluninfo.net. So that's FALUN info.net. And that's the website of the Falun Dafa Information Centre. And there you can sign up for a newsletter. You get regular reports coming out of China, but also some of the more, the special reports that we do several times a year. I mentioned one previously. I mean, one of the recent reports we did was this special report on looking at how the CCP targets Shen Yun around the world. That was a recent report we did. And there's also a bunch of documentaries and stuff you can get up to speed there.
Wow, very extensive. Yeah, so a lot of information there on the history and so on. So that's fantastic. A great resource. The show itself, how can people see the show? You say there are multiple companies traveling?
Yeah, so the tour each year. So first of all, every year the show's entirely new. So they re-choreograph it, they redo everything in the summer, and then starting in December through June, 8 companies go out and they tour around the world, including all across Canada. I think some of the shows have already happened, like in Vancouver. I think there's shows coming up in Quebec, and perhaps other parts in the East Coast. And the best way to find that is to go to shenyun.org, SHENYUN.org. And that's the main website of the company. And there you can read more about the company and you can find tickets to different shows around the world.
And the performers themselves, have they been targeted individually at all in any of these threats online, anything like that? Do they any aspect to that, or has it just been bomb threats directed at the company as a whole?
No, and actually it's a very good point you raise. A lot of them have been targeted individually, and particularly their families back in China, because a lot of the performers are Chinese. They have family back in China. I mean, just last year, actually, one of the principal dancers was Shen Yun. His name is Stephen Wong. So literally, as he's touring around America, taking the stage every night, his mother, who practices Falun Gong in China, was sentenced to 4 years in prison for her faith. And, he's the principal dancer. So there's, among those 20 pieces, I mentioned 1 or 2 about Falun Gong. And I'm just trying to put yourself in his shoes, where I remember there was a piece from last year where he's actually showing a story of a family of Falun Gong people, including a mother, being taken in and beaten by CCP officials and thrown in jail and all this stuff. So he's having to go out and act on stage what literally is happening to his mother back in China. And so we've had a lot of that. And that's been the majority of the way that they target an individual that's with Shen Yun, is they squeeze or put pressure, or they pay visits to, or they incarcerate and harass their family back in China.
Is prosecuting a case like this difficult for police? Because you mentioned that in some cases they're using diplomats or people from their embassies. Is there diplomatic immunity that comes into play here?
It's tricky. Yeah. So in the cases where they're using, they're very overt. They're using an ambassador. They're using a diplomat there. That we have to do for each country, because the rules are a little bit different in each country. Like, for example, last year, I think it was 2 years ago, in the Dominican Republic, the Chinese embassy there had put so much pressure on them to try and get the show canceled that they finally tracked down the president of the country at the airport. And so here you have the Chinese ambassador and some of his lieutenants sort of corralling the president of the Dominican Republic, threatening him with economic reprisals if he doesn't shut down the show. And so the president, luckily, like many of them, stood his ground and said, "What are you talking about? This is my country. We're going to do this." And Shen Yun performed. But when you have that level of sort of diplomatic pressure, it would depend on the rules in the country. So our government is certainly aware of it. And I think one of the things you've seen, like at least in the United States over the last 5 or 6 years, is the use of diplomats has gone down. One, because it wasn't working, because a lot of the theaters, like the theater in Arkansas, would just publicize the letter and give it to the FBI and have a press conference and make them look really bad. Partly because it's working, but partly because of the problem you're just talking about, is they're worried that they're going to be, this is certainly not the official role of a diplomat, and they could get kicked out of the country. And so they're starting to not use diplomats as much and use more sort of hired thugs and things of that nature. And that one, it's a little hard. I mean, there have been cases of people being arrested and stuff, but it's a little hard to trace it back to the CCP. They are proficient at utilizing so-called community groups in Chinatown, regular thugs off the street, to do their dirty work.
Here in Canada, we have a parliamentary committee, an inquiry, actually, not a parliamentary committee. It's an inquiry looking into foreign interference into Canadian politics and specifically the last 2 federal elections here. So we're into day 9 of this inquiry. It goes into next week. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau will testify, I think, next Thursday, next week a day anyway. And I guess what you're what you're saying or telling us here is an echo of what I'm hearing over at this inquiry that's ongoing right now. It's I guess this just shows the reach that the CCP has around the world and the way that they're trying to have influence over governments all around the world.
Absolutely. I mean, it's very interesting you're mentioning that. There are two quick cases I'd want to point out that speak to what you just said. One is that we just had 2 Chinese agents, CCP agents, arrested by the FBI 6-7 months ago because they were caught trying to bribe the IRS in order to target Shen Yun. So that's one case. We just had a Shen Yun troop coming back from Europe, landing in Chicago, and an ethnic Chinese U.S. customs official started saying all kinds of sort of crazy Chinese government type stuff at the U.S. border. Hey, you're Falun Gong, and therefore you're illegal and you can't be here. This is the United States, and they were talking to U.S. citizens. So, and those are just things that we can see. I mean, what else is going on that we can't? So I think the key word you mentioned is reach, and I think it's scary to think about how much the CCP has reach across our countries. Yeah.
Yeah, and they're into offering money to educational institutions. They're focused very much, of course, on influencing governments if they can, and the arts.
Yeah.
Why are the arts so important?
Yeah, we get that all the time, and I think what people need to realize is that it is the foundation of how their rule in China is considered legitimate. And I'm speaking generally here. There's always got lots of exceptions, but generally the Chinese people accept or at least tolerate being ruled by the CCP because of a narrative which is largely false. And that narrative is that the CCP is the one who took them from third world status, from the terrible situation they were in at the turn of the century, and lifted them up and gave them dignity and gave them a place at the table at the for the international community. And that's just a lie. It's not. The Chinese have done so much better without the CCP. And so any artistic group that counters that lie, that shows that that's not true, that shows that the Chinese people have a wonderful culture without the CCP, have a wonderful civilization without the CCP, anything like that, artistic or otherwise, they consider a direct threat the entire narrative that they've built their sort of legitimacy upon.
Is the show itself an expression of the ongoing struggle for freedom?
Not per se. I mean, it's really at its heart and soul, it's really about an expression of Chinese culture. And, you know, if you look at Chinese culture, it's the oldest contiguous civilization on earth. It goes back 5,000 years. And so there's just an amazing treasure trove of virtues and stories and legends that come through. So it's really about that. But if you look at the substance in any one of those stories, you will see things that are very Buddhist or Taoist in nature. You will see things where, you know, the story of Mulan, for example, and forget the Disney version, the real story of Mulan is one that goes to the heart of very traditional Chinese virtues of filial piety and these kinds of things. And so that's what really comes through in the show. But what scares the CCP, I think, is that this idea that the Chinese people have a direct connection to the divine, and that supersedes any connection that they have to the CCP. And that's embedded in Chinese culture. And that's what really scares them.
Well, I'm just glad that you have the freedom to perform here in Canada and in the U.S. and in, you know, some other countries around the world. I'm glad that you're helping to not just preserve, but resurrect or restore or bring back this culture for the world to see. Levi, is there anything else that you think we should focus on or think that we might have missed here?
I mean, the one thing that comes to mind is, and I don't, you know, you could decide whether this fits into the narrative of our whole discussion, but it is something that I've been surprised by the last 25 years, and that is the degree to which the CCP can implement disinformation in this country. You know, when I look at Chinese propaganda in China, you know, it's so on the nose, it's so obvious. It's sort of like, how does that stuff work? I mean, I always thought they were terrible at propaganda because I just look at, you know, the old posters from the 70s and the 80s, and I'm like, this is ridiculous. What I've realized is that actually they know how to put out disinformation long before we key that term. And they tune it to certain markets. And those posters from the 70s work in the Chinese market. But in the West, they've done a very effective job at saying, okay, what does the West care about? Well, they care about extremism and racism and these kinds of things. And they've built narratives around Falun Gong to try and get people to think that of us. And, you know, for many people, it doesn't work. But again, Falun Gong is a very foreign concept. People don't really know what it is. And so the extent to which they've been effective at trying to, I mean, if you think about Falun Gong primarily in the US and Canada, what is it? It's first generation, highly educated Chinese. That's for the most part. I mean, there's some people that are like me, Westerners and stuff, but for the most part, it's first generation. And yet, because of the CCP's disinformation campaign, they've been able to convince some people that, oh, maybe they're extreme far right, or maybe they're like we're lumped in with, I don't know what, the Proud Boys or something. Or there's this racial element. The racial element I think is interesting. Is they've for about 10 years they've had this narrative that Falun Gong is racist because we prohibit interracial marriage. Okay. That's ridiculous. I'm in an interracial marriage. I look at the Falun Gong community around the US and Canada. There's probably more interracial marriage there in that community than in most communities. Total lie. But people don't know what Falun Gong is. And so the CCP has been pushing that, and it gets some traction. I had this aha moment where last month in a Shen Yun performance down in Florida, there was a little protest outside. And you had American college kids holding up a sign that essentially said Falun Gong is racist because they prohibit interracial marriage. Where did that come from? Where does that kid get that information? How is it that the CCP can say, okay, we want to create disinformation about Falun Gong, and they're going to, you know, initiate a campaign like that, and here's this kid in college in Florida that believes it. So that was kind of an aha moment about, you know, the CCP's ability to influence on the political side, on the economic side is one thing. Their ability to decide and then execute on a campaign on how they're going to control and manipulate the thinking of Americans and Canadians, I think is the least explored threat of the CCP, and perhaps one of the most damaging. And we're just an example. There are many examples that go way beyond Falun Gong, but I think we're just an example of that.
Is this an example of the showing not just the power, the reach, but the risk of social media and information warfare?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think there have been plenty of studies proven that the algorithm in TikTok, for example, I mean, is deliberately trying to essentially degrade the morals of the people who use it, and lead them into sort of extreme kind of ways of thinking. I mean, it's very insidious, and that's just, again, one platform. Their approach to disinformation, their approach to propaganda, is very multifaceted and spans not just all digital platforms, but pretty much every facet of society. It is a fundamental part of what they do.
Yeah, well, I've noticed that social media, TikTok, it focuses so much on negativity, fear. In that way, I think that, and even just fallacy, fantasy, made up narratives in ways that I think you've really touched on something important. It's undermining the integrity, the foundation of our society, and building more and more distrust in our institutions and even our governments.
Yeah, I mean, I think, and again, just looking at the social media space, I mean, the amount of hatred between people is far greater in social media than it is in real life. And that's not an accident. And, you know, sure, that problem is beyond, is not just a CCP infiltration problem. That's a larger problem. Yeah. But you bet the CCP understands that vulnerability and is using it to great effect. And they are.
Yeah. So again, just one more time, tell people how they can reach you if they want more information, and how they can get information and even tickets for these shows.
Okay, so for information on Falun Gong, you can go to the Falun Dafa Information Centre. And by the way, the term Falun Gong, Falun Dafa, interchangeable, it means the same thing. Okay. And the Falun Dafa Information Centre can be reached at a website called faluninfo.net, FALUN info.net. And there you have all the news information regarding Falun Gong, certainly what's happening in China and around the world. To catch up with the Shen Yun Performing Arts Group, you could reach their website at shenyun.org, SHENYUN.org. And there you can read all about the company, but also see where they're touring around the world. They tour every year. They tour over 200 cities across 5 continents. So very likely they're somewhere in your area. And again, I think they're coming up, you know, in April, they'll be in the eastern part of Canada. And you can see, you know, tickets for shows and things like that on the website there.
Excellent. That's fantastic. Levi, thank you so much for joining us on the program. Extremely helpful. It's been helpful to me to better understand what this is all about, not just about a bomb threat, but the culture, the history, and I think this is very important.
Okay, thank you so much for having me, Rick. It's great to talk to you.
My privilege.
The information war is raging. Truth without integrity is worth nothing. Maverick News. Because those who have power and those who seek it must be held accountable.
The world is watching.
Join our family of truth seekers. Donate today and add your voice to the chorus of Maverick Knights. Donate at maverickdonations.com. Truth. Integrity. It's the Maverick way. Maverick News. The world is watching.